You've probably driven past one. A long row of orange or beige metal doors behind a chain-link fence, half hidden off a highway exit, with a sign advertising a unit for $1. It looks like the laziest business idea in America. Pour a concrete slab, bolt up some steel doors, and let people pay you monthly to store furniture they'll probably forget about. No employees serving customers all day, no inventory to restock, no product that breaks, just boxes and rent. That image is why self-storage has become one of the most recommended passive income investments on the internet. And for a while, the numbers backed it up. But the part nobody explains is that the version of storage that made early investors rich and the version that's currently sitting half empty in Phoenix and Orlando are the same business, running the same playbook, that simply hit its own success too hard. Understanding how that happened tells you something bigger about what recession-proof really means in real estate. And it starts with a pricing trick most renters walk past every single day without noticing. Start with why the simple version is appealing in the first place. Because it isn't wrong, it's just incomplete. A self-storage facility genuinely does have one of the leanest operating models in commercial real estate. There's no tenant improvement budget, no leasing agent walking prospects through finishes, no restaurant-grade kitchen to maintain. A single-story facility can run with a skeleton crew, sometimes just one manager overseeing hundreds of units, plus software that handles bookings, payments, and even the gate code remotely. Compare that to an apartment building, where a broken water heater is your emergency at 11 p.m., or a retail strip where a vacant storefront can sit dark for a year. A storage unit that goes empty just needs a new lock and a new listing. That efficiency shows up in the margins. Storage operators routinely report operating margins in the range that would make a hotel or apartment operator jealous, because so much of the revenue drops straight to the bottom line once the building is up and leased. That's the pitch you see in every How I Built Passive Income video. Buy the land, build the boxes, and collect checks with a phone call's worth of daily effort. Here's the part that pitch leaves out. Getting to the building is up and leased is no longer the cheap, simple step it used to be. And the gap between what people think it costs and what it actually costs is where the first wave of new investors gets into trouble. For years, the rule of thumb floating around forums and YouTube comment sections was that you could build a self-storage facility for somewhere around $50 a square foot. That number is outdated, and treating it as current is the first mistake a lot of newer investors make. As of 2026, a conventional single-story facility runs somewhere between $55 and $85 per square foot before land. Add climate control, which more renters now expect, since it protects electronics, documents, and furniture from humidity and temperature swings, and multi-story climate-controlled buildings run anywhere from about $105 to $170 per square foot. Then add land, site work, permitting, and soft costs, and the all-in project cost typically runs 25 to 40% higher than the construction number alone. Part of the reason those numbers moved is a chain of events that started well outside the storage industry. A 25% tariff on imported steel pushed domestic steel prices up sharply, and self-storage buildings are essentially steel boxes, steel frame, steel roll-up doors, steel wall panels. That single policy shift added an estimated 5% to total construction budgets almost overnight, on top of years of already rising labor and material costs. A developer who penciled out a project using 2021 numbers and broke ground in 2023 could find their budget short by hundreds of thousands of dollars before a single unit was rented. So the cheap-to-build reputation the industry earned in the 2000s and 2010s is now doing double duty as marketing for an asset class that has quietly gotten a lot more expensive to enter. That matters because it changes who can realistically compete, and it sets up the much bigger mechanism that actually drives profitability once the facility is open. This is where most explanations of self-storage stop, at the building. But the building isn't really the product. The pricing system is the product, and once you see how it works, you'll never look at that $1 first month banner the same way again. Every storage facility quotes you what's called the street rate, the advertised price for a new customer walking in the door today. That's the number in the ad, the number on the website, the number that gets people to sign the lease. But the rate a new customer actually pays, after promotions, discounts, and move-in specials, is called the move-in rate, and it's typically lower than the street rate, sometimes dramatically lower. During the most competitive recent stretch of the market, the average national move-in rate for a standard unit fell to under $100 a month, down more than 10% from the year before, as operators fought harder for a shrinking pool of people who were actually moving. Now, here's the number that explains the entire business model. While move-in rates were falling, the rent that existing, already leased tenants were paying, called the in-place rent, barely moved at all. At Public Storage, one of the largest operators in the country, the average rent that new tenants signed up for fell to roughly $11.60 per square foot annually, down from about $13 a year earlier. Meanwhile, the average rent per square foot that existing, already occupied tenants were actually paying sat at around $22.50, nearly double what a brand new customer would be quoted that same month, in the same building. Sit with that gap for a second. If you're a new customer walking in, you might get a unit for close to half of what your neighbor 2 doors down is quietly paying for the identical unit, because that neighbor has been renting since before rates went up. This isn't a rounding error or a temporary quirk. It's a deliberate industry-wide strategy called the Existing Customer Rate Increase, or ECRI. Operators lure new tenants in with a low, competitive move-in rate, and then every 6 to 12 months, they raise the rate on tenants who are already inside, often by amounts that would look aggressive if you saw them all at once, but that land quietly as a line on a monthly statement most people don't read closely. The reason this works is almost entirely psychological, not physical. Moving a couch, a treadmill, and 11 boxes of holiday decorations to a cheaper facility across town is annoying enough that most people simply don't bother, even when the math says they should. Storage operators are, in effect, monetizing inertia. The empty unit sitting there attracting new customers at a discount isn't really the profit center. The tenant who moved in 2 years ago and has quietly absorbed 4 or 5 rate increases since then, that's the profit center. The advertised customer and the paying customer are not the same person, and the gap between them is where most of the actual return lives. That single mechanism explains something that otherwise looks contradictory: how a facility can be renting new units at a loss-leading price while still posting strong revenue per square foot overall. It also explains why storage companies invest so heavily in software that automates rate increases and predicts exactly how far a given tenant can be pushed before they finally decide to move out. It is functionally a subscription business wearing a real estate costume, closer in spirit to a gym membership that's easy to join and mildly annoying to cancel than to a traditional landlord-tenant relationship. But notice what this mechanism depends on. It only works if there's a steady stream of new movers to replace the ones who eventually get fed up and leave, and if there isn't a cheaper competitor 3 blocks away offering an even better move-in deal. Both of those assumptions held up fine for years. Then they didn't, and that's where a business built on a genuinely smart pricing trick collided with an old, boring real estate problem. Too many people building the same thing in the same place at the same time. Here's the overlooked cost that rarely makes it into the passive income pitch. A facility can look financially healthy on the surface, say 90% full, and still be a weak investment, because occupancy alone doesn't tell you what tenants are actually paying or what it costs to fill those units in the first place. An operator desperate to hit a target occupancy rate will offer a first month free or a $1 move-in special, essentially buying a full building at the expense of that month's revenue. A facility can be full of tenants who are barely profitable, propped up by discounting that never fully unwinds because the local market is too competitive to raise rates aggressively. Full and profitable are 2 different things, and confusing them is exactly what happened at scale during the industry's most recent boom. Which brings us to the counterintuitive part. The very features that make storage attractive: low build complexity, minimal staffing, fast lease-up, strong margins, are the same features that make it easy to overbuild. A shopping mall developer needs anchor tenants, years of lease negotiations, and enormous capital before a single storefront opens. A storage developer needs a parcel of land, a permit, and roughly a year of construction. That low barrier to entry is a feature right up until every developer in a growing city notices the same thing at the same time. That's exactly what happened between 2020 and 2022. Pandemic-era migration sent hundreds of thousands of people moving to Sunbelt states, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Arizona, and storage demand followed them because moving and downsizing are two of the biggest drivers of storage rentals. Capital noticed. Nearly $50 billion flowed into self-storage transactions and development during those 3 years alone, more than the total for the entire 7 years before the pandemic combined. Facility valuations climbed to roughly $174 per square foot by early 2023, a level the sector had never seen. Now walk through the chain reaction, piece by piece, because each step made the next one worse. Rising valuations and strong rent growth convinced developers that Sunbelt storage was close to a sure thing. Easy entry meant dozens of competing projects broke ground in the same metro areas within a year or two of each other. Atlanta, Orlando, Phoenix, Charlotte, Dallas. Those buildings all opened around the same window, roughly 2023 through 2025, right as the migration wave that justified them began slowing sharply. Net domestic migration into Florida dropped by more than 90% from its 2022 peak, and Texas, Georgia, and Arizona each saw similar declines exceeding 50%. So a surge of new supply arrived exactly as the demand growth that had justified building it started disappearing. The result was predictable once you see the pieces laid out, even though almost nobody positioned for it in advance. Street rates in the hardest-hit Sunbelt metros fell more than 10% in back-to-back years. Operators leaned even harder on the move-in rate discounting trick just to keep occupancy from collapsing, which meant new revenue kept shrinking even as construction costs, remember the steel tariffs, kept climbing. Facility valuations fell roughly 12% from their 2023 peak. Developers who had locked in land and construction loans at 2022 assumptions were suddenly sitting on buildings worth less than projected, generating less rent than projected, in markets with more competing supply than projected. Some paused half-built projects entirely. New construction starts across the top storage markets dropped by double digits heading into 2026, essentially the industry pumping the brakes on itself, several years too late to help anyone who'd already broken ground at the peak. This is the part of the story that storage is recession-proof conveniently skips. Storage is resistant to a demand recession. People keep needing space for their stuff even when the economy wobbles. It is not resistant to a supply recession, which is what happens when an entire industry decides, independently, that the same handful of Sunbelt cities are all a great idea at once. The demand didn't collapse, the supply simply outran it, and rent is set by the balance between the two, not by demand in isolation. Not every market told the same story, and that divergence is itself revealing. While Atlanta, Orlando, and Phoenix were drowning in new units, markets where construction had stalled, parts of the Northeast and Midwest, cities like Boston and Chicago, saw rents actually recover and grow, in some cases by double digits year over year, simply because nobody had flooded those markets with competing supply. Same national trend line, same industry, opposite local outcomes, depending entirely on how many developers had made the same bet in the same zip code. The industry's adaptation to all of this has been less about reinventing the business and more about relearning restraint. The large publicly traded storage REITs, Public Storage, Extra Space, CubeSmart, and others pulled back sharply on new ground-up development and shifted toward acquiring distressed or underperforming facilities from smaller, over-leveraged owners instead, often at a discount to what those owners had paid at the peak. Consolidation accelerated. Because scale gives the biggest operators an advantage, the mechanism we described earlier actually depends on better data on exactly how aggressively they can raise rates on existing tenants without triggering move-outs, and enough capital reserves to survive a multi-year rate war that a smaller, single-facility owner might not. So where does that leave someone actually considering this today, in 2026? The honest answer depends heavily on which version of the story you're walking into. The best case outcome is still real. An investor who buys or develops in a genuinely undersupplied market, prices patiently instead of chasing occupancy with steep discounts, and holds through a full cycle, can end up with a low-maintenance asset generating strong, durable cash flow. The version of storage the pitch videos describe isn't a fantasy. It's just rarer and more location-dependent than it sounds. The realistic successful outcome looks more modest: steady, unglamorous returns that beat a lot of alternatives, specifically because the operating costs stay low, even while rent growth stays flat or slightly negative for a few years while the local market digests oversupply. The realistic negative outcome is what played out across much of the Sunbelt over the past 3 years, a facility that fills up, but only through discounting so aggressive that it barely covers the debt service, in a market with 2 or 3 newer competitors doing the exact same thing down the street. And the outright failure scenario is a developer who broke ground at 2022 land and construction prices, opened into a market that had already tipped into oversupply, and is now sitting on a building worth 12% less than projected, unable to raise rents without losing tenants to a newer facility next door, running its own move-in special. So go back to that image from the beginning. The metal boxes behind the chain link fence. The business that looks too simple to go wrong. It isn't wrong, exactly. It's just incomplete, in a very specific way. The boxes really are cheap to run once they're built and leased. What the picture leaves out is that the profit was never really coming from the boxes. It was coming from the gap between the price that gets you in the door and the price you quietly end up paying once leaving feels like more trouble than it's worth. And from a supply and demand balance in the surrounding market that can flip from favorable to brutal in about 18 months, once enough other people notice the same cheap-looking opportunity you did. That's the real lesson underneath the self-storage story, and it applies well past storage itself. An investment can be simple to operate and still be difficult to time. It can serve real, durable demand and still get crushed by supply that has nothing to do with demand at all. And a business that looks recession-proof because customers rarely leave can turn out to be entirely dependent on customers who never bother to check what a better deal looks like next door. The metal box isn't the product. The friction of moving out is.